to review these facts. So Spiro was the 39th president of the U.S. Vice President of the U.S. of A. in the late 60s and early 70s. He was born in Baltimore, otherwise known as Baltimore. And his parents were Greek immigrants. First thing to remember, the son of immigrants. Not only that, they were poor. Most immigrants were poor. So he grew up in an environment of need, in an environment of lack of resources, not in an environment of plenty. He was going to help him out. He had to help himself. His father, Theophrastos, let me see if I can get this, Anastopoulos, or something like that. He had a restaurant, but the restaurant failed during the Depression. So they lost everything they had. They had some savings, but with one of the 4 banking panics, they lost whatever savings they had. So not only were they poor, not only were they hard up, they also lost everything. His father ended up buying and selling fruit on the street, and Spiro would deliver those. So in many ways, you can see the young man being asked. He tried to find a little bit of money wherever he could find it. Why? Because he didn't have any. And when you don't have any, you find ways of getting something in order just to get by. He was brought up Episcopalian, and you can see how Spiro, as a young man, wanted to assimilate. He also changed his name. He did not want to be called Spiro. He wanted to be called Ted. Why? Because he wanted to be American. He did not want to be a Greek immigrant or the child of Greek immigrants. He wanted to be part of the mainstream. And that is important to understand. He changed his name, he changed his religion, he did everything he could to make a little money here and there. So nowadays, we would have called him a hustler. And he was also quite street smart. He knew where money was coming from, he knew where money was going to, even if it was not a lot of money. It was a question of survival for Spiro ever since he was a young man. Okay, I believe at that point it has gotten through to you guys. So you can understand the picture of young Spiro as a young man growing up in the 1930s, in the middle of the Depression. He went to Hopkins after high school to study of all things chemistry. Can you imagine Spiro the chemist? That would have been something. But he didn't get very far, so he dropped out and went to the University of Baltimore School of Law. I did not know that the University of Baltimore had a School of Law. Did any of you know that?
No, nor that you could get in without a college degree.
That was during the Depression. Or may not have, it appears to be like a private school. So Spiro went to school at night and sold insurance during the day to make ends meet and pay his tuition and pay his way through. He married Eleanor, and the other thing that is important to understand is that Spiro served in the army during World War II. He was sent to Fort Knox in Kentucky. Again, he was close to the gold, but not there. And he was assigned to his Third Army. He fought at the Battle of the Bulge. He fought also at Mannheim, Heidelberg, Bavaria. He had a very distinguished military career. Right in the middle of the action. So this probably affected his understanding of things. He had been recognized early on as a second lieutenant. So people recognize that this is no ordinary soldier. This is a man who has some talents. He has some leadership. He can get things done. He can follow commands, and he can also give orders when necessary. So he knew what orders from above were, and he knew what orders from him were. So he had that military frame of mind, in addition to his characteristics, growing poor as an immigrant in Baltimore. He was awarded the Bronze Star when he came back. And he eventually made it through law school and was admitted to the bar in 1947. His first job in private practice didn't work out. He just could not make ends meet as a private practice attorney. So he became first an insurance investigator and then a supermarket store detective. So he went and he tried to figure out who had broken into the pharmacy and stole all the X-Lax. That's the kind of work he did. So then came Korea. And it's hard to tell what he did in Korea or during the Korean War. All the sources that I reviewed are kind of silent. So it's difficult to state that he was shipped overseas or he was shipped to Hawaii or what he did. But he was in the service during the Korean conflict. Again, adding to his military experience. He came back to Baltimore, and he lived in the suburbs. Spiro Agnew was the first suburbanite vice president. That was at the time when the suburbs were growing. Many suburbs were being built at that time. Limit towns were arising here and there. And he was one of those men that enjoyed a few years of quiet life in the Baltimore suburbs. He became active in politics. In 1956, he helped other people get elected. So after the election, he was rewarded with a position in the County Zoning Board of Appeals. He was an attorney. He was apparently competent. So he was awarded a political position. In 1960, he lost the election for circuit court. But in 1962, he was elected executive of Baltimore County. And here we can begin to see another image of Spiro Agnew that we forget. That Spiro Agnew, the liberal. Spiro Agnew, the somewhat centrist or left of center individual. He passed, or he helped pass, an anti-discrimination bill that opened parks, bars, restaurants to all races. 1962, all of these places were segregated. All of them were. Spiro Agnew did away with that as being the leader. He opened up new schools for everybody, increased the salaries of teachers, which is always welcome, reorganized the police department, and improved infrastructure. So he had a pretty liberal and progressive attitude towards government when he was coordinator or executive of Baltimore County. He was very, very liberal according to our standards at this time. He did not like, however, in-your-face demonstrations. That was something that he absolutely disliked. He did not like militancy, probably because of his experience in the army. He did not like militant protests or militant actions or aggressive demonstrations. As long as they were peaceful, as long as they had permits, as long as there's no violence, as long as there was no disturbances of the peace, I was fine with it. But close-fisted, aggressive, insulting demonstrations, no. Again, and the best link I could find to that kind of inclination was his experience in the service, where he was used to taking orders without protesting, giving orders and having those executed. Are we beginning to get a picture of the man now, somewhat? All right, let's go on then. So he was an advocate of law and order. Wow, that's about magnified. He was averse to any kind of mass demonstration, and he was close to wealthy and powerful businessmen. You can understand that from somebody that grew up poor and paid his way through school and built himself up. Yeah, he was he felt comfortable in the company of wealthy, powerful men. He got appointed.
The bottom button should be your pointer.
I'm so sorry.
The button on the bottom should be your pointer.
The bottom of the.
There you go.
Oh, right. Good, thank you. All right. So he had his friends appointed as county insurance brokers. Why? Because he knew them. He knew what they could do. Ask ourselves, if we were in a position of government, how often would we tap people we knew, people we trusted, people that we knew were going to get the job done? I'd say often. Was it legal? Yeah, it was legal, but it was stretching it a little bit. It happens everywhere. No doubt about it. Agnew was identified in the mid-60s with the liberal Republicans. And we're going to get to the Rockefeller Republicans later on today. These included people like Tom Kuckel, Rockefeller, George Romney, John Lindsay, William Scranton from Pennsylvania. In 1964, Squire Agnew, who was executive of Baltimore County, he did not support Goldwater because Goldwater was too much on the right, too radical right for him. But eventually he said, well, he's a Republican, so I'll support him. He lost by a mile, but he lost. Agnew was nominated by the Republicans in 1966 for governor of Maryland. The Democratic candidate was George Mahoney, and Agnew very efficiently labeled Mahoney as a KKK member. Now, Mahoney was a piece of work. If he was a radical to the right individual, as they can be, he was against integration, he was against housing, he was against everything that Agnew was for. These were, of course, the years of the civil rights movement. So the position that Agnew espoused was very, very popular. Agnew did win the election, even though there were kind of questions about gambling interest and real estate property conflict. At this time, more or less, the second span of the Bay Bridge was being built. And Agnew owned some property in the vicinity of where the bridge span was going to be laid out. Whether he knew that ahead of time, whether he invested on that on the advice of his broker, whatever happened, he sold it and it was stuck. But the question was, even then, is this legitimate? Once again, we fall back on the story that he was a hustler. All his life, he was trying to find a buck here and a buck there. And if he could make more money doing real estate, heck, it even happens in our day, in this day and age.
No.
No kidding. No kidding. He was elected mayor of Maryland in 1966, took office in 67. It was a major achievement to be able to find how much the governor of Maryland was paid in 1967. $15,000 a year to support a family in Annapolis, dress himself, clothes, send children to school, I think it was later increased to $25,000. But for comparison purposes, a young attorney in New York City would start practice with a major firm in 1967 with a salary of about $10,000 a year. So 15,000 versus 10,000 was the difference, but not that much. What does this tell you? I think that corruption was built into the system in Maryland. That everybody was expected to skim something off the top, or to get some money under the table, or to get some funds or compensation illegally. Why? Because everybody did it. And the state, therefore, did not have to pay them that much. But this is a fact. This is how much he was paid. He undertook tax reform, clean water, supported desegregation in schools, fair housing legislation, and repealed a 300-year-old law that forbid blacks and whites to marry. The anti-miscegenation law. This was 300 years, and it was taken down during the administration of Spiro Agnew. In Virginia, it was Loving versus Virginia. Pardon?
Much later.
Much later, and that went to the Supreme Court.
So when the Equal Rights Amendment was passed in 64, those other laws could still be held in place?
I'm so sorry.
So like the Equal Rights Amendment got passed in 64, right?
The Equal Rights Amendment never passed.
Or no, I'm sorry, what was the amendment that got passed in 64, Lyndon Johnson?
The Civil Rights.
Civil Rights.
Civil Rights Act.
So when that law got passed, states could still have laws like this on the books?
Exactly. It was a state law.
Okay.
It was a state law. The Civil Rights law was a federal law. But this was a state law that forbid whites from marrying blacks and blacks from marrying whites. In 1967, there were riots in Cambridge following the speech of Rap Brown. And that speech of Rap Brown was really incendiary. It was recorded. Would you believe that somebody had a tape recorder and recorded that speech. So there's no doubt what he said. So Cambridge burns, baby burns. Agnew, as governor, rejected institutional white racism as cause for the riots. And when trouble developed at Bowie State, he closed the school. Says, you don't want to go to class, you want to demonstrate, fine. School's closed. When you're ready to come back to class, let me know, we'll open this. Then Martin Luther King was assassinated in April of '68, and there were again riots. A few dead, many arrested, fires everywhere, state of emergency. What does that mean? A week after Martin Luther King gets assassinated, he calls in 100 black leaders from all over Maryland to a special meeting in Annapolis. Okay, and all the black leaders, ministers, and legislators, and mayors, and whatnot, they come into Annapolis thinking that Agnew was going to say, we're so sorry that Martin Luther King got killed, we need to work together, this is a time for unity, reconciliation. No, Agnew said, look guys, you are responsible for this. You were supposed to be the leaders of the black people. You were supposed to hold down the riots. I blame every single one of you for what has happened. Well, that was a pretty radical position. People started walking out of the conference, and by the time he was finished, only about 40% were left. What was the overall reaction to that petition, you would say? Popular or unpopular? What?
Real. No.
Well, interestingly, there was widespread support, of course, for Agnew. Most of the people, and again, this was the 1960s, polls were focused on mostly white individuals. So most individuals supported Agnew. He had 80%, 90% approval.
From
It
the
was-
whites, from the whites.
Yes. Accepted by conservative Republicans. Nixon noticed it. This was an election year. Nixon said, hey, this guy has guts. He called in all the leaders that he made them responsible. Agnew at that time was chairman of the Rockefeller Republicans. And in the spring of 1968, the only other candidate was Nixon, because George Romney had gone to Vietnam. On the way back, I said, did they ever fool me? Did they ever brainwash me in Vietnam? And of course, the press took that up, and he was totally washed out, not just brainwashed, but totally washed out. Therefore, in March 21st, 1968, I remember that day very clearly. I was living in New York, and all the news was about Rockefeller. Rockefeller was going to announce for president. Rockefeller called a press conference, prime time, with all the TV cameras. Agnew was in Annapolis. So what does he do? He calls the press. Press, come to my office. We're going to watch Rockefeller announce for president. Rockefeller, Rockefeller. Rocky, Rocky, Rocky. The enthusiasm was tremendous. Trump has never seen enthusiasm like that. Ever. He wishes he did. Never. The enthusiasm was tremendous. Everybody was anticipating that Rockefeller was going to declare for president. So Rockefeller goes in front of the cameras and says, I have decided not to run for president. So you know how a balloon gets deflated? And the question was, the next day, as I recall, why did Rockefeller decline to declare for president? Which he did several weeks later anyway. Several weeks later, he changed his mind and he said, oh, I'm going to run. But by then he was totally deflated. He had lost his motive. And the only reason that is really valid is that he realized that he was too liberal for the Republicans at that time. That's probably the best reason why Rockefeller decided not to run for president in March of 1968. Let's get back to Agnew. Agnew was chairman of the Rockefeller for President wing of the Republican Party. So he became very rapidly a supporter of Nixon. Why? Because there was nobody else. Romney had been brainwashed, Rockefeller had withdrawn, nobody else was interested. So the only candidate was Nixon. So Agnew said, yeah, I'll support Nixon. Yeah, sure, I will. All right, no question about it. So Agnew became a Nixon supporter. And Nixon, of course, noticed him and knew about his stance vis-a-vis the militants. He said, this man could work as my vice presidential candidate. It was felt that Agnew would appeal to Rockefeller Republicans and was acceptable to the Southern conservatives. He had a solid law and order record. Isn't that something? A man so deep in
it's white collar.
Yeah.
That's okay.
a man so deep in lawlessness and well, let's leave it there. He was attractive to suburbanites because he gave off that image. He gave off the image of being a law and order man, a family man. He had worked hard. He had gone to school at night. He had educated himself. He had served in the army. He was a really good American image. And this was the election of 1968. Nixon and Agnew won the red states. Humphrey won the blue or purple states. And there are two things I want to point out about this. Number one, it is felt that Agnew helped Nixon win North Carolina, South Carolina, Kentucky, and Tennessee. These are 40 electoral votes. If we take 40 electoral votes from Nixon, he ends up with 261, which is not enough for an election. If that had happened, the election would have gone to the House of Representatives. So it is felt that Agnew helped Nixon in the long run win the election in 1968. There's another thing I want to point out, and please do not forget this. Humphrey took Texas with 25 electoral votes. Big chunk of electoral votes. Very, very, very important. Nixon lost Texas. If you read the story of Richard Nixon over many times, one of his main problems or fallacies was the fact that he would never let anybody win an election. After he lost to John Kennedy in 1960, after in California, governorship in 1962, he promised himself he would never, ever lose another election. But keep this in mind, Texas, 25 electoral votes went to Humphrey in 1964. 68, sorry.
It looks like Maryland went to Humphrey, even though Agnew was from Maryland, right?
Yes. That's it.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah, Maryland went for Humphrey.
Interesting.
Heavy Democrat, Maryland is a Democratic state. It's,
Interesting, the deep south went for Wallace.
what we're seeing with the current or the former governor is the exception more than the rule. So as vice president, Agnew was given an office in the West Wing, later moved to the executive office building, and appointed head of the Office of Intergovernmental Relations. They tried to give him something to do. But nevertheless, they just isolated and sidelined him. Agnew was so sidelined by the Nixon administration that he did not participate in Watergate. Agnew was free of sin as far as Watergate was concerned. That's how out of the loop he was. He was so far pushed to the side that he had nothing to do with Watergate. He did preside over the Senate. He was the critic of mass demonstrations, attacked demonstrators. He became Nixon's Nixon. Nixon had been the one who had, when he was vice president, had been the mouthpiece of the anti-press, anti-government part of the party. So Agnew became the person who did the same thing. He was the one who publicly criticized things. In 1968, Nixon developed or delivered a silent majority speech. Any of us remember that? We do remember that. Many people identified with the silent majority. The silent majority were supporters who supported the administration, but did not want to make their position public. This is the way I feel. No, I'm not going to say how I feel, but I am entitled to feel the way I do. That was the silent majority. The press was, of course, very critical of Nixon, and they gave, the Republican Party gave Agnew the job of responding to the press. So from there on, it was open warfare between Agnew and the press. Agnew accused the New York Times and the Washington Post of having a narrow viewpoint, and his approval rose to 64%. At that time, Agnew became the most popular Republican spokesperson. He was sought everywhere, and he was everywhere. He was very, very active, demonstrated a lot of energy, demonstrated a lot of know-how, and he conducted himself as a very astute politician. So he coined a number of great sayings that were quoted in the press over and over and over again, like this, nattering the box of negativism. And he called the press hopeless, hysterical hypochondriacs of history. He noted that some newspapers disposed of their garbage by printing it. So every time that he spoke, he came up with one of these lines that were not his lines, they were his speech writers. But anyway, you were sure that anything he said was going to be printed in the newspapers and was going to be quoted and repeated over and over and over again. So the conflict between Agnew and the press went on and on and on and on. You think the former president talking about, what is it, fake news? It's nothing new. It's that Agnew had it down to a T years and years and years ago. So 1972 comes around. Those were the years when Watergate began. And Nixon, remember Nixon swore to himself that he would never lose another election. Remember that map with Texas and 25 electoral votes? So Nixon says, what can I do to get elected in Texas? How can I win Texas? And then he realizes that he can deal with the former governor, John Connally. John Connally was the governor of Texas when John Kennedy was shot. He was the one who was riding in front of John Kennedy. The bullet that went through John Kennedy's back and not his neck went into his side and lodged in his femur, the thigh bone, and that was the magic bullet because that bullet was not even scratched. That bullet looks perfect under the microscope. But it is a magic bullet. The thing about John Connally was that he was enormously popular in Texas. Enormously popular. And he had switched parties. He was originally a Democrat, and now he was a Republican. So Nixon said, aha, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to get John Connally to run for vice president, which would have been a good choice because Connally was a very effective executive. He may not have liked his politics, particularly switching parties, but he was a very intelligent and effective executive. Fortunately, or unfortunately, John Mitchell and others convinced Nixon to leave Agnew on the ticket. The other thing Nixon wanted to do was appoint Agnew to the Supreme Court. Can you imagine Agnew in the Supreme Court? This is how close to catastrophe or something our government has sometimes come. So in 1972, Agnew campaigned actively, and he was told not to comment on his ambitions for 1976. Why? Because at that time, it was being considered as the frontrunner for the presidential nomination in 1976. That's how popular Agnew was in 1972. He was very, very, very popular. Vice President, possible President, Supreme Court. Pretty interesting. So this was the election. Nixon took Texas. Nixon took everything except Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. This is a sea of red. Everything went for Nixon and for Agnew in 1972. Problems then developed when investigators were looking into corruption in Baltimore County. Who initiated that? I think the federal government. It appears that they did not go for Agnew directly. It appears that they were investigating corruption in general, and they stumbled on the evidence that incriminated Agnew.
No, it was three local guys.
Yes, we're getting to that.
Did Maryland have sort of a history of corruption though?
I'm sure it did. Yeah.
We're getting to that in a moment, please. But the source of the investigation is kind of cloudy. They were investigating the whole affair, not individuals. They did not go after individuals originally, but the whole affair. The Republican DA, George Bell, it's not Beal, Bell, a young man at that time, he was able to indict Dale Anderson with 39 counts of extortion, bribery, and tax evasion. Dale Anderson was the county executive that came after that. They had everything but the videotape as far as evidence against these guys. One engineering firm here of Mass was kicking back 5% of the value of contracts. Agnew had received 10 grand in cash at the White House. Somebody had gone to the White House with 10 grand in cash. Remember, this was 50 years ago. 10 grand at that time was a lot of money. So Agnew could be charged on 40 counts of extortion, bribery, tax evasion, everything. The Wall Street Journal published a story in August, and there were a lot of negotiations going on for a long time. There's a theory that Agnew was considered for a long time as Nixon's insurance against impeachment. Agnew was so disliked by the press, one wonders why, that they could not fathom the idea of Nixon retiring or resigning or being impeached and having Agnew become president. As long as Agnew was there, Nixon was safe. But once the evidence came up of all this bribery and extortion on the federal charges, they had to go through. So the U.S. Attorney General got involved. There were a lot of negotiations back and forth. They were promises, this and that, and finally they agreed on one charge to which Agnew would plead no contender. I would not challenge this. I will not. It does not mean I agree I'm guilty. It means I will not challenge the allegations, which to us is about the same, but legally it isn't. Agnew was therefore sentenced to 3 years probation, fined $10,000, made to bring the money back into the government, pay the government back, and resign as vice president. This was very, very finely orchestrated so that Agnew would resign at this point, and minutes later, he would appear in court. Therefore, he was not vice president anymore when he was in court. He was a private citizen. And proof of that is this document that is Agnew's resignation letter that says, I hereby resign the office of Vice President of the United States effective immediately. I cannot read it, I have just memorized the text. But down here, you can see 1405 K. 1405 is the time of day, 2 o'clock, or 5 minutes after 2 in the afternoon, and K is Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State. So this letter was received by Kissinger at 5 minutes after 2. And shortly thereafter, Agnew showed up in Baltimore federal court and pleaded no contender. This is not an original document. This is a copy. The original document, nobody knows where it is. It disappeared from this. It's not in the National Archive. It's not in the State Department. It was not burned with the Watergate documents. Nobody knows where it is. They search for it far and wide. Nobody can find it. Somebody made a photocopy, and that's what remains. What happened to Spiro Agnew after his resignation? He borrowed money from Frank Sinatra, who was a guard in Maryland, but he became a consultant. So he made a lot of money as a consultant after being vice president. He wrote a novel about an ambitious vice president who worked in an environment where Jews had control of the media. And this was advised to everybody that Agnew had any anti-Semitic feelings. He had said things about Polish people, he had said things about Japanese people, but he had never publicly said anything about Jews. So this was a surprise to everybody when this came out. He moved to California, played a lot of tennis, played a lot of golf, received a loan from Saudi Arabia, again to pursue his anti-Zionism positions, and wrote another memoir called Go Quietly or Else, which apparently, according to this memoir, this is what the White House told him when he was resigning. You resign, you keep your mouth shut, otherwise, just imagine. He repaid Maryland about $250,000, and he paid it back. And he died of leukemia in 1996 after a one-day illness. One day he was healthy, playing golf, playing tennis, doing his stuff, got sick, died dead that night. So talking about Spiro, what can we say about his career? Candidates became more thoroughly vetted after Spiro Agnew. Particularly Jimmy Carter did that with Walter Mondale. The new right developed with Reagan after Spiro Agnew. And if all this had not happened, maybe Spiro Agnew would have been the leader of the new right, Ronald Reagan. The conflict with the media still survives. He could have been president or a justice of the Supreme Court. One thing about Agnew was that he was always very, very loyal to Nixon. Always. Personally, he said Watergate was a shame, it should not have happened, it was stupid, but he kept his mouth shut. He never criticized Nixon or the administration. So in general, Spiro Agnew was a son of immigrants who became more and more American. Having grown up in poverty during the Great Depression, he tried numerous occupations, he served in the army, and he favored civil rights, but could not tolerate any in-your-face provocation and confrontation.
I read or heard a big reason why they pushed to get him to resign is because they were working on Nixon to get out of the White House, and they were afraid he would become president in jail. So,
Exactly.
Yes.
yeah, I can't remember where I heard it.
Long time ago.
Yeah, there's nothing against a president being in jail.
Rachel Maddow just wrote a book called The Bag Man, where she covers all this in great detail, particularly how much money he was getting at the table.
Very interesting, thank you. Can we go to Nelson Rockefeller, please? Did you find this interesting about?
Very, very nice.
Is it easier now to try to understand a very, very complex person? It was really complicated.
Remembering pieces of it, but not the whole
Right.
stories of it.
Well, there's a lot more story, but this is all we can do.
Right.
Let's talk about Nelson Rockefeller. He was the 41st Vice President of the United States, the first Vice President, the second Vice President to be nominated, not elected. He was the grandson of John D. So he was certainly born into wealth, went to Dartmouth, majored in economics, and after graduation as a young man, worked for Chase Bank and for Rockefeller Center in New York. He was privileged to begin with, very, very privileged. No question about it. He was not particularly brilliant, but graduated Phi Beta Kappa, probably because his family promised to donate a couple buildings to Dartmouth or whatever. In any event, as a young man, he was recognized early on for having a very pragmatic and practical approach to programs. And he was excellent in leadership from a very young age and organization. The last thing about Nelson Rockefeller was that he was an attractive person. He had that warmth and that charisma that some individuals have and most of us do not. Certainly as a young man, he was a very attractive individual. As a young man, he went to work then for Creole Petroleum in Venezuela, which was a subsidiary of Standard Oil. It was kept in the family. There, he learned Spanish, became interested in Latin American affairs, and developed this relationship with Latin America from early on. Of course, they loved him in Latin America because he was told he was handsome, he smiled, he shook hands, he spoke Spanish. Ideal. At a time when the ugly American was popular in Latin America, Rockefeller was the antidote. So Rockefeller was never elected to Congress or to any legislature, but he was recognized as a talent and a worthwhile individual, and he was appointed first to the State Department, Assistant Secretary of State, then Undersecretary of HEW in 1953. He served under both Republicans and Democratic administration. As a young man, he was really recognized. This is the person that we want in government because he knows how to approach problems and deal with them. He was elected governor of New York in 1958 and re-elected in 62, 66, and 70. He was very much of a centrist. He expanded the State University of New York, expanded civil rights, doubled the number of employees in New York State, raised taxes 4 times, and quadrupled the state budget. So he was very, very active as far as building up New York State. In 1960, he tried to run for president, but Nixon was very, very far ahead. In 1964, he was too far to the left of center to become a threat to Barry Goldwater. In actuality, at the 1964 convention, Rockefeller was booed for 15 minutes because he had proposed a number of amendments to the Republican platform. Too liberal. They would not let him finish his speech. It's all on film, it's all on the internet. But he very graciously waited until everybody died down. He would begin speaking again, and they would boo him down. Okay, he would wait. He finished his speech. He said, okay, I've said my piece. Thank you, goodbye. Even in the face of a lot of hostility, he was quite gracious. Like we said before, in 1968, he lost the nomination to Nixon. But he was Rockefeller who brought Henry Kissinger into government. When Rockefeller was governor of New York, he had brought Henry Kissinger as an advisor from Harvard. So when Nixon became president in 1968, he said, hey, Nixon, there's a guy from Harvard that you should look at. It could be a very, of much value to your administration. He was considered too progressive. There were other problems with Rockefeller. One was the fact that he married Happy Rockefeller about a year after he divorced and about a month after she divorced. She was a socialite. And there is no doubt that her last child, while she was married to another individual, was the child of Nelson Rockefeller. And the family acknowledged that and recognized that. So there was almost rumors of infidelity and paternity. But the main problem was that he was just too liberal for the Republican Party. Then came Attica. We all remember Attica, don't we? Attica occurred in the summer of 1971. When the prisoners at Attica revolted, basically, and took over most of the prison in upstate New York. Now, Attica was no garden of paradise, but Attica was also a prison. The prisoners had some legitimate complaints and legitimate requests. Rockefeller, however, refused to meet with them. With a little bit more time, things could have worked differently. But what happened eventually was that Rockefeller authorized the National Guard and the state police to go in and take over the prison. As a result, there were 43 dead. Most of them, on autopsy, were found to be dead by friendly fire, not by inmates' fire, not by hostile fire. So the whole thing about Attica was a disaster, particularly because Rockefeller had always nurtured this liberal image, which was totally destroyed by Attica. He became more confrontational himself and less liberal, left the governorship and took other jobs. Here during one of the campaigns, it's Nelson Rockefeller giving the one-finger victory sign to a heckler. And this was a photograph that made all the newspapers at the time. So as he became older, he became more and more ornery and more combative. He was appointed vice president by Gerald Ford in '74. There were extensive hearings because of his wealth. He had made a large number of loans or gifts of money to a lot of people. He had been very generous. But in government, all of those things come into suspicion. So his hearings took many, many months. He eventually, he never moved into number one observatory circle. This is the house of the vice president, because he had a larger mansion than that. But he used that building for receptions and meetings and other activities. Now, being vice president in 1976, Ford needed a more conservative candidate. And he told Rockefeller being a good guy, went back to Ford and said, "Look, Mr. Ford, you want me to run? I'll run. You want me not to run? I won't run. Whatever you want me to do, I'll be glad to do that." So 1 year before the election, Rockefeller withdrew from the candidacy for vice president in 1976, and Dole was then nominated. Rockefeller went back to New York. He became president of the Museum of Modern Art and died unexpectedly in unusual circumstances in 1976. He died with a smile on his face, they say, in the company of a much younger and attractive lady. We need to say a word about Rockefeller Republicans. They were basically, this group were moderates to liberal on domestic views, strong in the Northeast, and weak in the South and in the West. This group of people were sometimes liberal, sometimes conservative. They were conservative on fiscal policies and liberal on domestic policies. Larry Hogan would have fitted well into this group, in the sense that he was not always, the Rockefeller Republicans were not always close to one particular argument. Sometimes they were practical, sometimes they were pragmatic. Sometimes they were conservative, sometimes they were more liberal. In other words, they tried to assess a situation and came up with the best solution. The Rockefeller Republicans became the Eastern establishment of the Republicans. They were in favor of civil rights and also of government spending. Most of Albany here was built by the Rockefeller administration, and a lot of infrastructure, and of course, an enormous expansion of the state university. They were more hawkish than dovish on foreign affairs. They were internationalists, like Rockefeller, who had spent all that time in Venezuela and knew Latin America very well. Liberally, they were culturally liberal, very much in favor of education, and also sponsored things like a social safety net, universal health insurance, balanced budgets, all those good things. Supported labor unions while they were strong, and then when they became weak, they were not so supportive. So the Rockefeller Republicans were really pragmatic, functional individuals. If it works, we're for it. If it's not going to work, we're not. All right, that's the idea of the Rockefeller Republicans. Oh, good, we have a few minutes to go to Mr. Mondale.
All right.
Mr. Mondale is probably the individual most responsible for what we consider the modern vice presidents. During these seminars, we always ask the question, what do you expect the vice president to do, since there is so very little in the Constitution to do? So people say, we expect the vice president to be a good spokesman or spokesperson for the administration. We expect the vice president to show up, to be visible. We expect the vice president to be transparent. We expect the vice president to be a communicator. We expect the vice president to be available. We expect the vice president to be ready to be president any moment. And even recently, there was another article here in the Wall Street Journal, how to choose a vice president. And the guideline is, running mates don't matter much, but they should be prepared, to fill the top office. In other words, they should be ready to become president. So all these things were really fleshed out, articulated by Walter Mondale and his aides. So the nation owes Walter Mondale the current view of the vice presidency. He was the Democratic candidate for president in 1984. Have you seen how all of these vice presidents in the Senate had wanted to become president, but never did? Can you think of a person more unfit to be president than Spiro Agnew? Can you think of a person more fit to be president than Rockefeller? Whether you agree with his politics or not, the man was in many ways like Cheney, who had an enormous amount of experience as being a leader and being an administrator and being a diplomat and having connections and knowing how things were laid out. Interesting how many great people, enormously qualified, never made it. So Walter Cronkite was born in Salem, Minnesota. Where's Salem? Somewhere in Minnesota. All right, never heard of it either. In 1928, he went to Macalester College, which is a nice liberal arts college in Minnesota, similar to Washington College in Chestertown.
Brain school.
Very good school, very good school. And he also went to the law school at the University of Minnesota. This is the theater at the University of Minnesota in front of the Great Lawn. The theater of the University of Minnesota is memorable because we used to give classes there and exams, like Psych 101, 3,000 students at once taking Psych 101 exams. And the acoustics at the University Theater were terrible, absolutely terrible. You think Chesapeake College acoustics are bad? It's even worse. So Walter Mondale entered politics early and was a supporter of Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey, and we will point this out momentarily, was the force behind the Democratic Farmer Union Party. And we'll say why this is of relevance. So Walter Mondale then was appointed Attorney General and then appointed to the U.S. Senate in 1964 when there was a vacancy. So originally he was not elected, but he was appointed, and then he was elected. The Minnesota Democratic Party merged with the Farmer Labor Party in 1944. And the importance of the Farmer Labor Party is that it was the most important third party in the United States when it existed. We say now that there is the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and all little minor parties. No, Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota was very, very strong. It certainly had a left-wing orientation. There were many communists in the Farmer Labor Party. So when it fused at the behest of Hubert Humphrey with the Democratic Party to form the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party, Hubert Humphrey had to get rid of all the communists. And he effectively did. So the Democratic Farmer Labor Party is still quite important and very, very strong in Minnesota. Walter Mondale in the Senate was considered left of center. It was in favor of civil rights, abortion, fair housing, desegregation, tax reform. Originally, he was in favor of the Vietnam War, and then he flipped. Now, in 1976, he was chosen by Jimmy Carter after a very, very thorough search. Carter was not going to run the risks of picking up an Agnew or anybody else like that. So he did a very, very, very thorough search. And he came up with those characteristics that we just mentioned. In other words, he wanted a man that was, or a woman, that was ready to be president at any moment. At that time, Walter Mondale was. The other thing that we need to remember in reviewing the history was that Carter and Mondale were very similar as far as the concept of government, and personally they liked each other, which was very important. There was no hostility between the two. They could disagree, which they did, on a number of things, but they could always remember that they were on the same side. And they never criticized each other openly or publicly. They kept their disagreements to themselves. So that made for good press. So Mondale was chosen, and during the campaign, and this is another thing that some of us remember, was the first vice presidential campaign debate. The debate between Walter Mondale and Bob Dole. Bob Dole was far to the right, Mondale was pretty much left of center. The Mondale-Dole debate was really enlightening, because Mondale came up as smooth, intelligent, not dogmatic, approachable, a likable individual, very well informed, very articulate. And Dole came across as a very angry, bitter man. Now, Dole was a war hero. He had had his arm just about blown off by a shell, and he could not use his right arm for all practical purposes beyond holding a pen. So he had reasons to be angry at life. But the way he came through at the debate, there was no question. Mondale was the superior candidate. No questions asked. After the election, Jimmy Carter said to Mondale and his associates, look, why don't you come up with a job description? Now what? The job description. What would you like to do as vice president? Give me an hour and I'll come up with it. And they did. The chief of staff and other individuals got together and they came up with a job description for the vice president, which Jimmy Carter read, agreed with, and approved. It signed. It's part of the National Archives. So the vice president then was supposed to be an advisor and spokesman, full-time participant, and troubleshooter. And of course, he was ready to pick up immediately should anything happen to the president. So this was the idea of Walter Mondale and his staff to build up the vice presidency to where it is today. Interestingly, as vice president, he only cast one tie-breaking vote in the Senate, just one. 4 years, one vote. He was important in the Camp David Accords, and this did not make the press that much. Jimmy Carter divided his time between Camp David and Washington, while he sent Mondale over to Camp David on a regular basis. And the idea was keep negotiating. Don't give up. You don't disagree. Keep negotiating. Find something you can agree on. Okay, find something you can grow with. Keep going. So Walter Mondale really contributed to the classic Camp David agreements. They did disagree, Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale, on several issues, including the Allen Mackey. Does anybody remember the Allen Mackey affair? Allen Mackey was a former Marine that had served his time, gone back to college, and he decided then to go to medical school. He applied to the University of California, I think at Davis. And the University of California turned him down. Even though he had good grades, he had good recommendations, he had a good entrance examination score. In other words, he had good credentials. And they found out that they had accepted, because of affirmative action, a number of candidates that had a lower GPA, lower grade exams, not as good quality. So he sued. Why should they accept this person and that person? Well, Jimmy Carter and Mondale were on different sides of this. Jimmy Carter was all for affirmative action, and Walter Mondale was for. Some things are based on merit more than anything else. So Mackey eventually got into school. He was eventually accepted, even though the case was not decided in his favor. But this was a disagreement that Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale had in private. They did not hear it. They did not discuss it publicly. But individually, they did disagree on this and a number of other things. The Carter administration, as you recall, was perceived as being weak, indecisive, somewhat incompetent. That occurred because of inflation. Remember the malaise speech when Jimmy Carter went on at night and said, this country is under a state of malaise. We all feel bad about ourselves. We have to stop feeling sorry for ourselves. No, it's, he got a lot of criticism for that. And then the Iran hostage crisis. And this is a photograph we won't remember of the helicopter in the desert that crashed and burned when they tried to rescue the hostages. So Walter Mondale became the first activist vice president. He had offices in the West Wing. He attended cabinet meetings. He had weekly lunches with Jimmy Carter. He was a party to classified briefs, which many vice presidents were not, including Truman, for example, who did not know anything about the A-bomb. He became president. He knew there was something big going on, but he did not know the details. And he had a lot of visibility as a spokesman and a troubleshooter. In 1984, he was the Democratic Party candidate for president, and he chose Geraldine Ferraro as the candidate for vice president, first woman to be a candidate And Miss Ferraro was a congresswoman from New York, a young woman, attractive, very articulate, nice presence, smooth, extreme, conduct herself with a lot of poise, but her husband had problems. The problem with Geraldine Ferraro's husband was that he had some dealings with individuals who had contacts with the underworld in New York City. What the contacts were, maybe one of his companies, he was a slumlord in New York City. Maybe he had rented an apartment to Luca Bracci, who had, by now been sleeping with the fishes for a long time. Something like that. Not something personal and close, but some distance. I think the point was that just about every day during the campaign, there was a disclosure that Mr. Sakharov had these dealings with the underworld. And it was a constant distraction. In addition, Reagan was very, very popular. So it was impossible to win. The Democrats got Minnesota and the District of Columbia, and everything else went to the Republicans. One of the issues at that time was the ERA, and I don't want you to leave without realizing how close the ERA came to being approved, being ratified. The ERA said that rights under the law will not be denied or abridged on account of sex. It was basically to prohibit sex discrimination. One of the original authors was Charles Curtis, who was vice president under Hoover. So the ERA was approved in 1971, and through 1977, 30 of 35 had ratified the ERA. 38 were needed for ratification. Most of the opposition to the ERA came from the South, and interestingly, from women. Many women were against the ERA, and these were the arguments. I'm just stating history, I'm not in one favor of one or the other. These were the arguments that were made at that time. The ERA would eliminate protections for women in labor law, like night work and heavy lifting. In other words, women would have to work at night or engage in lifting. Yes. Women would be drafted into the military. Remember, this was 50 years ago. And drafted would mean to be drawn into the military without your approval, or without really any alternative.
And being a high school student, that really scared us.
So sorry?
I was a high school student.
So you remember this?
Yeah, that was scary.
Now, women would lose alimony payments. Women would not be favored to obtain custody in divorce cases. Those were the major arguments that were made against the ERA. So Nevada, Utah, Arizona never ratified. The southern states and Illinois, interestingly, Virginia did not ratify. And the ratification process stalled. So the time limit for the amendment expired. They tried to extend it a little bit, but again, no more states would come through.
I think
And
they have now. I think they now have, I'm working on that.
Right. That may come again. May come again. Yep. The fact was then that some states, I think 2, maybe 3, rescinded their ratification. That is, they took back the ratification after they had come out to ratify the ERA. Those were the times of Walter Mondale. He became ambassador to Japan under the Clinton administration, served for 3 years. He was a candidate for Senate from Minnesota when Paul Wellstone was killed in an airplane crash. He retired to Minnesota, still taught in the law school, but died in 2021. So generally considered, Walter Mondale really shaped what we understand as the modern Vice Presidency, all without changing the Constitution, and all depending on the goodwill of the President and the good chemistry between the President and the Vice President. He is generally considered a good man, a good Democrat, and a good Vice President.
You did it.
We did it.
3 minutes, that was
Only 2 minutes over. Thank you so much for coming. I'll be glad to stay here for a while and make commentaries, observations.
One thing I found interesting about all of